Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us for today's webinar, 5 Elements of a Successful Transformation, a Playbook for Oil and Gas Companies. My name is Nicole Bamford and I'm the moderator for today's session. On behalf of the ALULA and the OGIQ teams, we thank you for joining us today. This session will be presented by John Dale, Global Energy Practice Leader, Managing Director at ALULA, Brian Cole, Senior Principal at ALULA, Casey Langer, Principal at ALULA, and they will be moderated by Beth Staley, Senior Content Specialist, also from ALULA, and their presentation promises to be well worth the listen. Before we get started, here are some quick administrative points. During the webinar, if you have questions for our presenters, please submit them in the Q&A box on your screen and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Likewise, for any technical issues, please write them into the Q&A box and we'll get to them right away. You will notice the widgets on your screen can be resized and dragged around for your viewing preferences. Please note that this session will be a panel discussion and have no slides, so we recommend that you make the media box the largest on your screen. I encourage you to visit the Resource Center on your screen for additional content and links we and our sponsors have provided for you. So make sure you're sitting comfortably, and I'll now hand it over to Beth so we can begin.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Welcome to today's webinar, 5 Elements of a Successful Transformation, a Playbook for Oil and Gas Companies. My name is Beth Staley, and as someone dedicated to transformation stories that feature people and their commitment, it's my pleasure to moderate this final event in our 3-part series. Since we already discussed how to prepare for and operationalize transformation, we're taking a big picture approach here to explore the 5 elements that our panel experts have been using to help clients achieve and sustain major transformations. For more information on the 5 elements, we invite you to check out our position paper on transformation capability, as well as our resources on leading through ambiguity and digital transformation. Without further ado, welcome John Dale, Brian Cole, and Casey Lineker. And can you all please introduce yourselves before we dive into our questions?
Sure, I'll start. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Nicole. Yes, my name is John Dale. I've spent the last 25 years working on change and transformation projects, primarily in the oil and gas industry. And for the last 10 years, I've spent most of my time advising senior leaders on their roles in leading large transformations. So glad to be here. Thank you.
I'll go next. My name's Brian Cole, and very similar to John, I've spent over the last 25 years in the change space, large transformations, also happen to be in the oil gas, as well as a lot of other industries. And it's just been a fun adventure, and look forward to sharing some of our insights with you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Lineker. I have 15 years of transformation experience focused exclusively on large-scale transformations, both in the public sector as well as the private sector. So from Department of Defense, Pentagon, all the way to the energy corridor here in Houston, and then internationally from Africa to Canada. So certainly understand the importance of what we're about to talk about today. I've lived it. I've been side by side with organizations going through it, and look forward to sharing those perspectives. I also look forward to your questions. So thank you in advance for capturing those. Oftentimes so much value comes out of those questions, so we look forward to your participation today as well.
Thank you, everyone. And I agree with Casey. We really want to make sure that we can speak to all the questions that our attendees have. So yeah, thank you in advance for everything you'll ask us. Today's webinar is really inspired by the challenge for senior leaders to lead transformation while competitively running their day-to-day business. They often ask us, how can I balance changing my business while running it? How do I get people in my organization to consistently look at their business, identify opportunities for improvement, stop non-value add work, and execute on new ideas? Across the board, our answer is spend time paving a pathway from compliance to commitment. So Brian, to get us started, can you talk about the difference between compliance and commitment and why it really matters?
Yeah, absolutely. I find it helpful to think of compliance as simply doing the bare minimum to meet a demand, a request, or a need. In other words, doing enough to get by. However, commitment is really going above and beyond what is required, and it will help, you really transform your organization, drive the change you're looking for if you go beyond the minimum, because the minimum is just not going to cut it, especially at this day and age. But I've also found that if you truly have commitment, there's a greater chance that you'll be able to stay the course when challenges arise.
Great, Brian. And I know as these challenges arise, as they often do throughout a transformation, a great way to pave this pathway is through our 5 elements of a successful transformation, which is the title of this webinar and our playbook for oil and gas companies. So John, can you talk to us a little bit about what these 5 elements are?
Yeah, and in building on what Brian was saying around the difference between compliance and commitment, our approach and these 5 elements are really designed to drive commitment, drive engagement, so that people are looking to go beyond just the bare minimum, but do what really needs to be done. So, if you boil it down and at a high level, the 5 elements that we use, and these are, you'll see these are kind of general, but we'll talk about some of the meat behind them. The first element is make it possible, we call it. And make it possible is really about getting senior leader alignment at a very deep level on what we're going to do, why we're doing it, how we're going to do it, and when we're going to do it. The second one is make it clear, that's about getting stakeholders, key stakeholders, and the broader organization aligned with the change. So they know what's coming, they know their role in it, they have a sense of what might happen to them, to the extent we can talk about that. Then the third phase is make it real. And there's really 2 parts to this. There's designing the change, and then there's designing the deployment of that change. And the fourth is where everyone wants to jump to begin with. It's, as soon as we start talking about transformation, and we call it make it happen. And make it happen is when we're starting to go live with the change, when things are really happening. And then the final one, which is really important, is around sustainability, and we call it make it last. And that's where we are looking to align systems and processes like performance systems to support the new change.
That's great, John. If we dig into this first element, make it possible, we talk about this element really hinging on leadership alignment. Why is leadership alignment so important, and how do we get it?
Yeah, it's often a step that is skipped, or we kind of blow through it, and we look at a bunch of head nods and say, "Oh, everyone's aligned." But leaders, not just leaders, people in the organization, but leaders in particular, they really just want to get things moving. So when there's a transformation, they'll typically stand up a team, appoint a leader, and task that team with making it happen. And then as leaders, we step back and go back to do our day job, so to speak. And so if leaders aren't fully aligned and they just jump to that, delegate the change, and they're really looking to get to that, make it happen, things can come unraveled, and they definitely slow down. So I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard leaders say, "That's not what I thought we were going to do," or "That's not how I thought we were going to do that." And it just brings things to a slowdown. So getting that alignment up front, it can feel slow, it can be challenging, but getting it before proceeding significantly increases the chances of success. And I always say, and some of the folks I work with might get tired of me saying it, but I say, go slow to go fast. If we take our time in the beginning, we can go much faster in the end. But if we go too fast in the beginning, we're going to end up slowing down.
That makes a lot of sense. So if leadership alignment is really important to that first element, make it possible, is there something that's really important for that second element, make it clear?
I'll take that. So let's start with the end in mind for make it clear. And it really builds off of what John just mentioned. So when we expect at the end of this phase, people throughout the impacted groups, they should know why they're being asked to do things differently. They should understand their impact and the impact to their business. Consistent, clear messages are being asked, and they really relate to the importance of the change, and it's being shared across the groups. leaders are sharing those common messages regularly and are engaging at all levels of the organization. And that's a piece that I just want to call out and we'll talk about in a moment that's often missed. And overall, the organization is aligned on the business outcomes. So that's, in a perfect world, that's what we would love to see once we've really started to dig into making it clear. So during that period of time when the organization and the leaders in particular are focused on making it clear, they're going to be looking after that case for change. It'll be very clearly defined and clear path for rolling that out and being able to execute that with the leaders really doing that. The scope, the impact, the high-level change roadmap is defined and understood. And then there's a behavior shaping plan that we absolutely would want to see during this time, which lays out those clear behaviors. And there's clear agreement for how we're going to measure and track growth across the organization toward achieving those behaviors, which ultimately will deliver the transformation that we're looking to deliver. So I'm emphasizing these elements because there's some pieces here that is oftentimes missing when we think of transformation. So typically leaders understanding their role in the change and focusing on the leadership behaviors necessary to achieve that desired outcome, that's a typical miss that we'll see oftentimes if we just focus on a traditional approach to transformation. So leaders demonstrating the commitment to the change is key. In that first phase, they understand and they're gathering their own personal commitment, and now they're going out and really representing that. And why is that essential? Because organizations are reflections of their leadership, point and simple. So if you as a leader don't clearly engage and consistently demonstrate genuine commitment and authentic commitment to the change, why would anybody else buy in? So this is where we begin to see progress stall in traditional change management if some of those elements are missing during this time.
That's really helpful, Casey, because I think one thing I want to emphasize is how it clear is different from just change management, right? If this make it clear phase is really all about compliance to commitment, we want to make sure we understand how, we're doing transformation, not change management. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that distinction?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you caught that. It's something I oftentimes engage with leaders on, and oftentimes they'll ask me, isn't this change management? And so I want to say emphatically, no. And I say that from a perspective of having lived exclusively within traditional change management at the early start of my career. So I've seen the gaps firsthand. I've seen that if executing traditional change management still didn't yield the results we were after, and at the time I couldn't understand why. So the key differentiator as we're talking about these different make it pieces is the focus on the enhanced role of leadership and the emphasis on behaviors. Those pieces are largely missing with any traditional change management methodology. And that's really why we wanted to be very intentional and clear in calling these elements out through these make it phases, because that's critical to address the gaps. So let me give you an example here. As John was mentioning, traditional change management relies, typically you'll see a network of change agents, or they'll call them champions. Leaders delegate to others. Perhaps the leader will stand out and, at a town hall and give their message. And, but typically we found that's really the only evidence of leadership evidence of transformation at the leadership level. And at the end of the day, with traditional change management, you run the risk of ending up with a series of really pretty deliverables, but the behaviors within the organization don't change. You won't see people working differently. You won't see the change adopted. So when you use traditional change management, what we have found is that there's a higher risk of failure. And if they do end up succeeding, they really do end up taking longer. They go over budget, and it's a lot more painful than the organization and leadership originally anticipated. So by focusing on the leadership and putting behaviors clearly, or excuse me, by putting leaders clearly in the driver's seat and by focusing on behaviors, companies and leaders can effectively mitigate that risk and achieve better results more quickly. So the oil and gas industry today is faced with urgent transformation needs. And personally, I see an end state where there are clear winners and losers. In my opinion, the companies that focus on the behaviors and emphasize clear ownership from leadership through these transformations, they will come out ahead more quickly with better results and less negative impact on the organization. So one other just distinction, Beth, real quickly, is that a lot of companies have their own established change management methodology, or they leverage ProSci or something else that's industry standard, and that's wonderful. And in no way are we saying that those frameworks cannot be used or aren't useful. In fact, that they quite are. We oftentimes partner with companies that have that established framework, but the key here is to identify the leadership and behavior needs and work to fill the gaps that those frameworks don't address. So it does not have to be a choice of one methodology over, say, the make it focus. It oftentimes is both.
That's really helpful, Casey. Oh, yeah. Please, John.
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to, in terms of context, because we are talking a lot about leadership, which is critical, of course. But for those in the audience who are the change agents and the people who are trying to drive it, what we do spend quite a bit of time with folks to help them influence leaders and to make these things happen. So it's not that, just sitting with the leadership team. It's really helping change agents, whether it's in HR or other areas, to help them really do these things and influence leaders to go through this. So I just wanted to add that for folks in the audience who might be in that side of the equation.
I love that, John. And oftentimes, so I worked with a large-scale company within the aviation industry, and that was exactly what happened. And they were able to really fill their role far better because they were, they were able to partner with leadership in different ways than they had before. And it was absolutely a step change for them in terms of their effectiveness as change agents. And it was really fun to see.
Great.
That's awesome, Casey. Does anyone else want to add anything to their experience in using these first two elements, make it real and make it clear, and how they see it working when companies are dealing with these large-scale transformations? Brian, is there anything you want to say?
I'll just briefly chime in, if that's okay, John. I know folks will think, boy, this work takes a lot of time and effort, and it does. And as John's alluded to earlier, it's time well spent. You prevent those false starts. But it's really telling of an organization, are they actually ready for the change if they're willing to invest the time in that? Because so many organizations want to jump to more the execution or the make it happen type of phase, but they're ahead of the rest of the organization and they're not aware of it. So the leaders is like, yeah, let's go. They don't recognize the rest of the organization might not even be fully aware of the business case. Why are we going through this change? What does it really mean for me, the organization? And if they haven't spent that time helping with those pieces, everybody else is going to be sort of left behind and stuck.
That makes sense. So let's get beyond those first two pieces. Once leadership is aligned and the organization is really clear about their transformation, what happens next during this third element? Make it real.
Brian, do you want to take
John,
that one?
Sure, I'll start it and I'll let you keep going on some of the make it real, because it's really helping get the rest of the organization ready. So you're starting to design and plan and organize what you're going to do, but it's like, what does this really look like? And starting to get into the details of, hey, the key results that we're going to be paying attention to, what do people really need to say and do differently? And as leaders, how do we set that up? So I'll let you kind of build from there, John.
Yeah, no, it's good, Brian. I think the key things I see on that is, as I mentioned earlier, there's designing the change and then designing the deployment. And so designing the change is, it's really mapping out the plan, things like communications, training, demonstrations, pilots, those sort of things, and when are we going to do those. Designing the deployment is really about the behavior piece that Casey referenced, and it's understanding who needs to do what differently and when. And if you think about it, unless somebody does something differently, there is no change. We can talk about it, we can put in systems, but someone needs to do something differently. And so that designing the deployment is really understanding what it is that, who needs to do what differently at a pretty detailed level. And once we understand that, then we can not only prepare them, but prepare their leaders so that their manager, supervisor knows what to look for, what to reinforce, how to correct things. And so it's really two parts to it. And often you see folks spend a lot of time planning the change, but not planning the deployment with the same rigor. So thanks, Brian.
That all makes sense. Anyone else have anything to add on Make It Real? So as we're moving right along here, we get to this fourth element, which is make it happen. So what's that all about, Casey?
Sure. So this is the fun spot for me. I get excited about this as well. So this is where the magic can happen, right? If the first phases are done properly, if the time and energy is spent to go slow, to go fast, as John was saying, then this should feel really far easier because all of the right pieces are in play. And at the end of this piece, right, we would expect to see that transformation realized, where the new behaviors and results are realized. And going into that, as they're starting into that deployment, which we oftentimes don't use that word, you would see leaders and key performers confident and energized, know what they're doing. Everybody is set up for success. And everybody's working toward that common direction. All of the hard work planning is paying off. Example of activity during this time would be training launched, the initiatives, varying initiatives underway, especially with large scale transformations. It's a variety of smaller initiatives that lead to that broader transformation. So all of that's underway. There's clear accountability and ownership. So, and during this time, we certainly would expect and really help influence leaders to be focusing on the right leadership behaviors that they're working on and demonstrating. And as part of that, leaders should be showing up and observing the organization and the key performers. They should be focused on removing those critical barriers that will slow or stall progress, and really starting to provide feedback and reinforce the right behaviors when they see them done well. And of course, really emphasizing that feedback loop and really making sure that they're showing up in the right ways. So during this piece, the transformation's in full swing across all the impacted groups.
I love that. So we've gotten through make it possible, make it clear, make it real, and make it happen. And I love that emphasis that you put on observation too, Casey. I mean, I think that's such an important piece of this. Does anyone else want to speak to make it happen and some of the things that are really critical to success at this phase?
One thing I'll add, Beth, is we're talking about this sort of as these different elements, like sequentially, but it's not. It's a very iterative process. So during the make it happen phase, we might get evidence, we might find evidence that things aren't going the way we had planned, that there's something we need to do differently. And that might cause us to kind of go backwards a little bit to an earlier element to adjust, whether it's adjusting how we're communicating it, where we might find that leaders aren't aligned because they're not doing their part in this. So I just want to highlight that point.
Yes.
This is an iterative process, not a linear process.
John, I'm really glad you mentioned that because I've personally experienced this with a client recently, and the cause for needing to revisit some of the earlier pieces was related to just some large leadership transitions. It just so happened that it was a busy season for retirements, and as well as leaders moving within the organization, was just changed the nature of those that were impacted and those that needed to lead. And so therefore, we needed to be very intentional about making sure that those that are new in the organization were set up for success and brought through, just like the other leaders were. And so it's very much that that iterative process and something that can be reapplied and needed to be paid attention to throughout, for sure.
Good add, Casey.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Oh yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one more piece. I found it's really beneficial to actually, share with the folks that we're working with that iterative part very early on, that there's a high probability that as we're going through this, there will be a need to come back and revisit some pieces so that they don't see that as, oh my gosh, we messed up, or what did we do wrong, that it really is a normal part of the process. So let's plan for it so we're able to handle it when it occurs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated hearing Casey bring up that role of intentionality, because we can't just say things like go slow to go fast and go, back to go forward. There's really an important piece of intentionality that we have to bring to those moves, right?
Yes. And certainly in this space, the word intentionality, and when we think of the transformations that this industry is going through and will be going through coming up, that intentionality is a word that I'm hearing used more and more from leaders, which is very exciting for me because we are also in a very hybrid working environment. There's a lot of different disruptions and changes. And so the organic opportunities that leaders have to lead and influence aren't as prevalent as there used to be. So they have to be far more intentional about how they're going to influence and lead, how they're going to show up and what that looks like, because the casual walk-bys or lunches just aren't happening the way that they used to. The world of dynamics and technology has changed. So leadership intentionality is a critical element that's going to be very important in the coming years as the industry goes through this transition.
It's really helpful to hear. And that intentionality too is also one of the ways that we really help people move from compliance to commitment, and so
Exactly.
That's the thing we're bringing into each of these, 5 elements of a successful transformation, that the importance of intentionality cannot be underestimated. So I appreciate that. Anyone else want to add anything to that intentionality piece?
So the other piece, just to circle back, because it seems inherent for us, but we live in this world, right? I referenced before some of those critical leadership behaviors and that clear direction that they're going to be communicating. And then how do they really remove those barriers and observe performance in the right ways and have that feedback and coaching element incorporated? If you think of those 5 leadership behaviors that those leaders should be exhibiting, that demonstrates their personal leadership commitment, which again is what we're trying to achieve here. And so it's not through the words, it's through the actions and the behaviors that commitment is communicated.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. And this brings us to one of the biggest issues we really hear about sustaining change. And this brings us to the last element, the make it last element. These challenges to sustaining change aren't going away anytime soon. So Brian, can you speak to how we really work through this element and help people make transformation last?
Absolutely, and I'll start with something that John alluded to earlier in terms of iterativeness. Actually, one of the first things to be thinking about from a sustainability standpoint is start planning for it well before you get to the sustainability phase. So early and often, as you're thinking about through the early parts of make it real, make it clear pieces, what are some of the more larger things that you need to look at in terms of new processes? How do we make change in some of our reward and recognition systems so that you're looking at those opportunities to say, well, what are the new behaviors? How do we reinforce and recognize those from a both informal and formal standpoint to keep those things going so that we can not only sustain the change, but also be ready for continuous improvement and looking for the next change. So you really have to start working at that stuff early and identify, what are going to be some of the barriers or the obstacles that we're going to face in terms of sustaining it? How do we remove those sooner than later so that by the time you do get to the sustainability phase, it's going to be easier? Now, with that said, it's still a lot of time and effort, and it's going to take work to do that. And that's another one of the challenges to overcome, is recognize that this isn't going to take care of itself. I mean, just last night I was actually meeting with a client, and one of the things he mentioned is, we're pretty good at starting and implementing transformational change. We don't sustain it well. And one of our biggest challenges is we get fatigued, we're ready to move on to the next thing. It's like, is this change done? What's next? And we don't take that time to really build in the changes to the processes, procedures, work with our other business partners and HR in many cases of saying, hey, what do we need to do differently in terms of our selection, our onboarding, our training to help, ensure that the new behaviors, processes, and procedures that we put in place to really transform, that they are going to stick. So yeah, invest time early and often, and it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but be willing to put forth the effort, because if you don't, you're going to fall back to your old habits very quickly.
Right. Anything else to add, John or Casey?
So
I think, go ahead, Casey, please.
And I appreciate what you were saying, Brian, about that fatigue, because that is real. And I had a similar conversation about with a different client the other day about that. And I can assume that your client, like mine, was a senior leader. And if the senior leaders themselves are fatigued, can you imagine what the lower levels of the organization are feeling, right? Because it's a lot more of an impact to them in their day-to-day operations. And so this is a very slow burn in terms of the right behaviors and getting that. And the leaders have to be steadfast in their commitment to that change and can't let that fatigue stop them. And it's something that's very real. And I'm seeing that, especially as we get toward the end of the year. Also, there's some situational factors that, factoring in, and it really can lead to momentum loss and take you a few steps backwards if not actively managed.
Yeah. That's kind of where I was going to go, Casey. You said it very well. Just one other piece too. The one thing, I have a client that says, we're really good at starting work, we're just not good at stopping work. And so yes. I think a big part of this sustainability is, and this is really even earlier in the process, but is looking at things we're doing that we can stop, because it does reduce the load on folks so they can focus on this piece. So yeah, so I like that saying, we start work, but we just don't stop it.
Exactly. And we often look for, okay, are we seeing the right behaviors? Sure. Are we seeing still the other behaviors that are the old behaviors? Well, we're still seeing those too. And I recently uncovered, hey, well, we wanted everybody to lead and think and align together differently and make decisions differently. But we never stood, by we, I mean the client, never stood down the decision-making bodies that were part of the old way of working. So. So it's really important to focus on the stop of work as well.
That's all really helpful. I want to remind our audience that we do have some resources that might really help you, might help lend some additional context to the things we've been talking about today. We have a paper on transformation capability that actually goes through these 5 elements of a successful transformation. We also have a paper on leading through ambiguity, which I think also speaks to some of these issues that have been brought up about the kind of fatigue that people have, especially as they're, sustaining change. And then we also have another paper on digital transformation. So I hope you take a look at these resources. If you haven't already, you might even open them up now while you think about some of the final questions that you might send over our way so that we can speak to your immediate concerns. Before I do go over to some of the questions that are coming through, I'd like to give our panelists a chance to give us all sort of their best piece of advice for the people going through these large-scale transformations right now, no matter where they are, in the playbook, no matter which step they're at, what is your best piece of advice that you can offer? And anyone who wants to go first?
Well, I'll jump in then.
Awesome, John. Thank you.
This is yeah, you're welcome. For me, I think, and I'm going to take it from the perspective of the change agent and the person who's trying to help make the change happen. And I would, the thing I think is just really understand the influence you do have. I think often folks in a change position feel like they don't have authority, so it's hard to have influence. But you can have a lot of influence if you understand what it is that's driving leaders to do things, and having conversations with them and so on. So I would say just really understand you can have influence, significant influence. It's just how to go about that. And there are some tricks to the trade to do that, but really understand the power that you have.
I'll
Thank you,
step
John.
in.
Casey, yeah.
So do not confuse understanding for alignment. So understanding is where individuals have understood what you're saying, but that doesn't mean anything about how they're showing up, what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're behaving. That doesn't necessarily change. So just as John mentioned earlier in the call here, I believe, head nodding, that's understanding. So, but what's typically missed is looking for the evidence of alignment. And we're not expecting everybody to agree on the transformation. It's not whether they think it's the right direction, but that instead of that, despite that, they are aligned and they are actively working within their role and remit to advance and achieve that transformation. That's true alignment. And I see that very oftentimes missed, typically because it's just shortchanged. That understanding, taking the initial understanding and moving it toward alignment is something that is fast-tracked and just assumed that is done, and it tends to have some misses for sure.
That's really helpful. Brian?
Yeah, you're going to hear a bit of a theme here. For me, I characterize it as don't take alignment for granted. So we as Casey alluded to, it's like you get the head nods and yeah, there's that understanding, but you really do have to check and probe for it. And because if you don't, it's going to derail your efforts quickly. I'm willing to bet everybody on this call has experienced that at some point where it's gone wrong. So you also have to not think of leadership alignment as a one-time event. It really is a process.
Yeah.
You need to monitor, pay attention, check in frequently for alignment, highlight and actually discuss where you see misalignment and talk about what's behind it, what's driving it, so that you can come back to that notion of really good commitment, because people will see through it very quickly. As you get deeper in the organization, it's like, oh, those driving or behind the change, they're not fully aligned. Boy, should I be. So yeah, don't risk it. It is worth that time and effort, as we mentioned earlier today.
And that brings back that importance of behavior too, not only the importance of modeling behavior, but of reading behavior so that you really can understand what's going on in your organization. I want to refer to a question that we have from our audience. How do you feel the gap between the aging workforce, the one that might be reluctant to change, and new employees coming in?
I'll jump in again since that's an awesome question. And we're seeing this in a lot of our clients where there's this trough where you have a lot of earlier career folks coming in, and then there's more senior people. And I love the way the question's set up, because there are a lot of new folks coming in, but you have senior folks. And I think the most important thing is that regardless of whether you're a new employee or experienced employee, is understanding, what's going to happen to me as a result of this change? How's it going to impact me? And I'm thinking of an example where in doing some digitization in oil fields and digitizing things like procedures, job safety analysis, and things like that, where more experienced folks are really used to the paper pencil way of doing it and all that, but to get them into this digital thing, the most important thing to do is to talk with people and understand what their concerns are, what it is that they might be afraid of, and then address those concerns. So in the digitization, folks were feeling like their jobs might go away because it's being more automated. Well, instead of that, what they learned was it was making their jobs easier and allowed them to spend more time on things that matter to them more. And so it comes back to really making sure people understand what's going to happen to them as a result of the change.
And to build off of that, what they do matters. So for the leaders that are senior in their career, maybe even a year away from retirement, I have a few of those. Wow, they're leading a transformation right now, and it's incredibly different. They're taking a way of working very process-driven and turning it more into an innovative, way of working. And those leaders are showing up in a way to demonstrate that commitment, irrespective of the fact that they're going to be exiting. So it doesn't matter that they necessarily have a short runway before that they exit, but it's that they are laying the groundwork and getting that momentum started and showing up in the best way they can to demonstrate that commitment. On the flip side, I have other leaders who have literally said, listen, I'm out next year. I'm not going to be focused on any sort of changing my behaviors or showing up differently. Can't teach an old dog new tricks. So it's the choice of the leaders to decide how they're going to show up despite where they're at in terms of their career.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to add anything to this really great question about filling that gap between, and aging in a new workforce?
One more thing that just came to mind, if you don't mind, Beth, is that certainly there are key differences, with the older generations and newer generations. And the leaders can better understand that if they're really actively practicing that engagement, that coaching, that deep understanding of the needs of the organization that's maybe different than what their needs were at the beginning. And that starts at the very get-go, even at the recruiting process or hiring process. People coming in are wanting to know if the company's commitment to the transformation, to sustainability is real. And that's very different. Oftentimes in years past, folks were very focused on the compensation packages, et cetera. And so leaders knowing this, because they've engaged the workforce, they understand that. When they, from day one, they're showing up in a different way to demonstrate a different outcome that they're looking to achieve for their business, which then really resonates with those younger generations. So it's very possible for those leaders to make that connection so long as they're actively engaged and getting that feedback and coaching that younger workforce.
That's awesome. That's really helpful, Casey. And I just want to let our audience know that if we don't get to any of your questions, we'll be sure to get back to you via email or somehow, because I know we have some other questions coming in too, and we're running a little short on time. But here's another one. Can you give an example of when leaders were not aligned, and how did you help them get aligned? So this is really a question about how do you know if in your organization, you're looking around how do you know if they're not?
Beth, I'll jump in on this one because I have it's one of my favorite examples. I know we're short on time, but I was working with a group, a business unit, and they had laid out a new transformation that it had 5 elements to it. And so in October of the year, they did this big rollout, all these people. And then I met up with them in January and I said, how's it going? And they said, oh, it's deployed. It's out there. Everyone's doing it. It's working. And I'm a playful person, so I happen to have a Mentimeter, an online survey thing. So I just asked, and this was the leadership team, I said, what are the 5 elements of this program? And not a single member of the leadership team got one of the elements correct. And I'm not exaggerating. And so that was an example of not being aligned because they were saying it was out there. And so what we came back to, and it was eye-opening to them, but what we came back to was, to some of the points Brian and Casey have made earlier, everyone nodded and said, yeah, we've got this, we know our role. But they had made commitment to the change, but not commitment to acting. So we came back to what is it you need to do as leadership team members to make sure this is happening? What questions should you be asking? What should you be looking for? But just something as simple as asking them details about the change can be really helpful to understand, are they aligned or not?
Anyone else want to add anything to that? I think that, and it pretty much brings us to our time as well, but thank you, John. It's such a great point, just asking people, making sure that, we're communicating with one another and that we all know what kind of change we're working on. It's really important. I want to hand things back over now. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Thank you for your questions. And again, I hope you'll refer to our resources if you want to learn more about those 5 elements of a successful transformation, or ways of leading through ambiguity, and also, working through digital transformations. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, Casey, and Brian. Really, really happy to talk with you today.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth, John, Casey, and Brian, for this very informative discussion today. I'd also like to thank everyone watching wherever you are and for taking the time to listen in. If you do want to listen to this webinar again, the session will be available on demand shortly. And remember to check out more of our upcoming events and on-demand webinars at oilandgasiq.com. And again, thank you so much, Beth, John, Casey, and Brian, for your time today.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.